What's good, everybody? It's Mike Reed, and welcome to My Life Ministries, where leadership, influence, faith, and evolvement are the principles that we look to live by every single day of our life. And by us living those principles, it helps us to help youth to become motivated young leaders to implement faith every day in their lives as well. Just ask God. He wants us to. He wants us to ask Him. He wants us to ask Him for what we need. He wants us to ask Him for the desires of our heart. That's a command of God. You have not because you ask not. Anything you ask for in my name, He's telling you to ask Him for it. Although He already knows what you need, He already knows what you desire, He already knows what's going on, but He wants you to come to Him and converse with Him, and have that conversation with Him to where you can ask God and lay it out to God, the things that you need. And once He begins to hear that, and once you trust in Him enough to say, Lord, I'm going to ask you for this, then that's when God is able to help you through it. He's able to bring those things to pass, and He's able to make sure that He sticks to the promise that He's already promised you, which is His word. And a lot of times when we get to the point to where we want to ask God for certain things, the enemy comes in and he makes us feel guilty about asking God for the things that we need, and especially asking God about the desires of our heart. He comes in and he mixes us up, and he confuses us, and he brings in all of these negative thoughts in our mind, to saying that if you ask God, that's not you trusting Him, or you don't believe in Him, or your faith is not strong enough that God is not going to show up. You're supposed to just be believing and just trusting that He's going to automatically do this and do that. God wants us to bring everything to Him. He doesn't want us to sit around and have these anxious thoughts, to where we're so, filled up, and, it's almost like, if you have a pop can or a soda can and you shake it up and you're just ready to explode. And the only way that it's going to be released is once you open it up. We have to begin to release, everything that we're feeling and everything that we're going through, in our life, to God, and ask Him for the things that you need, and be bold with what you ask Him for, and if it's according to the will of God, God is going to bless you with that, and you have to understand that. But don't sit back and hold everything on the inside of you and not go and talk to God about it. Don't be afraid to express yourself. Don't be afraid, to talk to God about it. Ask Him, because that's what He is looking for. He's looking for that. And the enemy is upset when you go to him and you ask him that, because what that shows is that you're sticking to the word, you're sticking to what he says, when he tells you to ask him, and that God is going to show up in your life. And what that does is that eliminates the enemy from any thoughts that he tries to put into your mind. He wants you to feel bad. You ever been in that position to where you want to ask God for something, and you feel like, the thing that you're asking Him for, like, it's too much, or, if I ask God for this, maybe it's not going to come, or maybe it's not going to work out. Have you ever been in that position? When you begin to feel like that, that's the voice of the enemy. He wants to keep you in this pit. He wants to keep you consumed. He wants to keep you, doubting. He does not want you to walk in faith. There's so many promises that God has in His word, according to asking Him. There's so many promises according to asking Him. And we have to make sure that even in our ask, we have to make sure that we are walking by faith. We got to make sure that we are walking in faith. We got to make sure that we are living in faith. We have to make sure that we are living according to the plan of God, and we are living according to the purpose of God. And we got to make sure that our relationship with God is there, so that when we do converse with Him, that He understands, and that He knows that whatever he or she is asking me for, the moment that I bless him or her with that they will be able to handle it, and they're not going to forget about me. They're not going to abuse it. They're going to be good stewards over whatever it is that I give them. They're going to make sure that they do the right things with it. They're going to stay within my will. They're not going to step out and do their own thing, or, begin to feel a certain way, allowing pride and ego, or whatever the case may be. God knows that He can trust you because He reads your heart. So when you ask God, You have to make sure that when you go to him and you ask him for these things, that you go to him with the right intentions. You go to him with the right motives. You go to him, making sure that the ask that you have, even though that is something that is going to be beneficial to yourself, that is something to where you can understand that, God, I will make sure as a person, as the man that you call me to be, as the woman that you call me to be, to make sure that what you bless me with, the things that I'm asking for, whether it's a need or whether it's a want or whether it's a desire, when God opens up that door for you, you have to make sure that you handle it according to the kingdom. You got to handle it according to the plan and according to the will of God. That's how God blesses you, because he sees that. In the moment that you begin to share that with him and express that to God, God sits back and he's pleased with the fact that you trust him enough, not allowing the enemy to put all these thoughts into your mind to make you feel guilty or make you feel bad or make you feel like you don't trust God enough because you're asking him for this. God wants you to continuously ask him. Continuously ask him, asking him, you have to make sure that you do that, and don't be afraid and don't be fearful when you go to God for it, as to if, you're fearing the answer to be no. God's going to make that decision anyway. He's going to make that decision anyway to make sure that if it fits with his plan or if it doesn't, so be ready to accept what God has for you. Whether the blessing is what you physically, what you get from what you ask him to do for you in your life, or even if he sits back and he says, no, not right now, but you got to take it to God and you got to ask him. And do not be afraid to ask God, because he wants us to ask him for the things that we need and the things that we desire. So ask God. Don't allow it to sit on you. Don't feel guilty. Don't feel bad. Don't let the enemy trick you. Ask God.